The flashing red and blue lights cut through the evening sky, and a patrol car came to a stop behind a lone driver on a quiet street. It started like any other traffic stop, but this encounter was anything but ordinary. The officers approached the vehicle with confidence, expecting a routine exchange. What they weren't ready for was the calm yet firm response from the person behind the wheel. "Can I see your ID?" One officer asked, his tone authoritative but not aggressive. The driver leaned slightly out of the window and responded, "Am I being detained, or am I free to go?" The tension in the air was palpable as the officers exchanged glances, clearly caught off guard. This wasn't the usual compliance they were used to. The driver knew their rights and wasn't about to give in without understanding the reason for the stop. What followed was a fascinating back and forth that left both sides questioning who was really in control. In this video, we'll break down every moment of this unique standoff, explore the legal principles behind ID refusal, and see how a calm understanding of the law can turn the tables. Stay tuned. This is a story you won't forget. The officer's request for ID hung in the air, but the driver wasn't intimidated. Calmly, they repeated their question, "Am I being detained, or am I free to go?" The officer, clearly not used to this kind of pushback, hesitated for a moment before replying, "We're conducting an investigation." The driver, still composed, pressed further. "What's the nature of the investigation?" "I'd like to know what law I'm suspected of breaking." The officer's expression shifted slightly, a mix of frustration and uncertainty. It was clear this wasn't going to be a quick interaction. As the conversation continued, it became obvious that the driver wasn't just being difficult for the sake of it. They were someone who understood their rights and wasn't afraid to assert them. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a lesson in boundaries and authority. The second officer, who had been silent until now, stepped closer, his body language firm but not aggressive. "You need to cooperate, or this will escalate," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. But the driver wasn't rattled. "I'm happy to cooperate if I'm being lawfully detained," they responded. By now, passersby had started to notice the interaction, adding another layer of tension to the unfolding scene. The first officer shifted his stance, clearly trying to keep control of the situation. "Listen," he said firmly, "we're just asking for some identification. If you've got nothing to hide, this will go a lot smoother." But the driver didn't budge, their calm demeanor still intact. "Officer," they replied, "I understand you're doing your job, but without reasonable suspicion of a crime, I'm not required to show my ID. Isn't that correct?" The second officer glanced at his partner, the unspoken tension between them growing. They weren't used to this kind of challenge, a citizen so calm, so informed, and so unyielding. The first officer leaned down closer to the window, lowering his voice. "We're not here to argue law with you. Just hand over the ID, and we can move on." The driver's hand stayed on the wheel, a small but deliberate gesture to show they weren't resisting. "I'm not arguing," they said evenly. "I'm asking for clarity. If I'm free to go, I'd like to leave. If I'm being detained, I'd like to know the reason." Meanwhile, the passersby had grown into a small, curious crowd. Some took out their phones, quietly recording, while others whispered to each other about what might happen next. The officers noticed, their discomfort evident. For the driver, this wasn't about causing trouble. It was about standing firm on their rights. But for the officers, it was quickly becoming a test of authority. The standoff continued, the tension mounting with every second, as both sides wondered who would make the next move. The air grew heavier as the silence stretched. The first officer, visibly frustrated now, straightened up and exchanged a quick look with his partner. Without saying a word, The second officer stepped away from the vehicle, speaking into his radio. The driver's eyes followed him in the side mirror, but stayed calm, their hands still resting visibly on the steering wheel. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the first officer said, his voice slightly sharper now. The driver met his gaze, unwavering. "I'm not making anything hard. I'm just asking for my rights to be respected." The crowd on the sidewalk grew larger, their murmurs becoming louder. A man in a baseball cap leaned over to whisper to a woman holding a phone. "They can't do anything unless he's detained, right?" Someone else chimed in. "I think he knows his rights better than they do." The officer with the radio returned, his expression tense. "Backup's on the way," he said to his partner. The words lingered ominously, raising the stakes for everyone watching. The driver, unfazed, simply nodded. "That's fine," they said, their voice steady. "The law doesn't change, no matter how many officers show up." The first officer's hand hovered near his belt as he took a step closer. "Last chance," he said, his tone more forceful now. "Give me your ID, or this is going to escalate." The driver, calm but firm, responded once more. "Am I being detained, officer?" The tension was electric now, like a wire stretched too tight and ready to snap. Everyone, officers, the driver, and the crowd, seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next moment that would decide everything. Just as the first officer opened his mouth to respond, a new figure emerged from the growing crowd. A woman in business attire stepped forward, her phone in hand. "Excuse me, officers," she called out, her voice calm but firm. "I'm a legal observer. I've been recording this interaction." Her presence caught everyone off guard, adding another layer to the already tense standoff. The officers glanced at each other, their frustration now tinged with unease. The second officer took a step toward her. "Ma'am, you need to stay back. This is an active situation." But she didn't flinch. "I'm staying within my legal rights to document this. And from what I've heard, your reasons for detaining this individual are unclear." The driver's eyes flickered with a hint of relief, though their calm demeanor remained intact. "Thank you for being here," they said quietly, their voice just loud enough for the officers to hear. The first officer shifted his focus back to the driver, his tone hardening. "This isn't a public debate. We've got procedures to follow." But the woman wasn't done. "And those procedures require reasonable suspicion," she said, cutting him off. "What's the basis for your stop?" The crowd grew bolder, emboldened by her confidence. Phones were held higher, whispers turning into murmurs of support. The tension skyrocketed as the officers found themselves not only facing a resolute driver, but also an informed and vocal witness. Just then, the faint sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Backup was on its way, but the question hung heavy in the air. Would it de-escalate the situation or push it to a boiling point? The sirens grew louder until another patrol car rolled up, lights flashing. Two more officers stepped out, their presence adding weight to the situation. The crowd fell silent, the tension now almost unbearable. The first officer took a deep breath and turned to the driver. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded. The driver, still calm, replied, "Am I under arrest, or am I free to go?" The officer clenched his jaw, but before he could answer, one of the newly arrived officers approached. He looked at the driver, then at the woman with the phone, and finally at his colleagues. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone measured but curious. The woman quickly spoke up. "They've been demanding this driver's ID without providing reasonable suspicion or cause. I've been recording everything." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. The new officer turned to the first one. "Is there an actual reason for this stop?" His question seemed to catch his colleagues off guard. The first officer hesitated, then muttered something about a routine check. But the new officer shook his head. If there's no legitimate reason, we can't detain them. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. Reluctantly, the first officer stepped back. Fine, he grumbled, clearly unhappy. You're free to go. The crowd erupted into murmurs of approval as the driver gave a small nod and said, "Thank you, officer." Just as the driver was about to leave, the legal observer called out, "I'd recommend filing a formal complaint. You've got witnesses." The driver smiled faintly and replied, "I'll consider it." As the car pulled away, the officers turned to disperse the crowd. But before anyone could leave, a young man in the group spoke up. "Hey, isn't this the same officer who pulled something like this last week?" The crowd fell silent again, the twist sending ripples of shock through those still watching. The officers froze, their expressions unreadable. The legal observer turned back to the group, her phone still recording. "Sounds like there's more to this story," she said with a knowing look. And with that, the tension shifted. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a bigger conversation. As the driver disappeared down the street, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the moment lingered. People whispered among themselves, some sharing their own stories of encounters like this, while others exchanged videos they had recorded. The legal observer stayed a little longer, ensuring the officers knew she was still watching. The young man who spoke earlier approached her, asking questions about the driver's rights and how situations like this should be handled. The officers regrouped near their vehicles, their frustration clear but unspoken. The new arrival, who had de-escalated the situation, glanced back at the crowd before quietly speaking to his colleagues. Though the words couldn't be heard, his tone suggested a reminder about professionalism and procedures. For the driver, it wasn't just about that single moment. It was about setting an example for everyone watching. They had stood their ground, not with aggression, but with calm confidence, showing that knowing your rights can make a difference. The crowd eventually thinned, but the echoes of what had unfolded left an impression on everyone there. The lesson was clear. Authority should always be balanced by accountability, and it's important to stand firm when you know you're in the right.